Hello, and welcome to the podcast, An Intelligent Look at Terrorism. I'm your host, Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada. China has been in the news an awful lot lately for a whole bunch of different reasons. We here in Canada, of course, are seized with this notion that the government of Xi Jinping has decided to seize two Canadians illegally. We call them the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, in retribution for Canada's decision to arrest Meng Wanzhou, who's the chief financial officer of Huawei, on allegations by the Americans that she was involved in getting around Iran's sanctions. This is a huge bilateral incident for Canada and China, by the way. China's also been in the news because of what's happening in Hong Kong lately. A recent border war with India has risen up for the first time in decades, with casualties on both sides. What they're doing in Tibet, the whole, the Chinese call their One Belt, One Road initiative, which is building infrastructure around the world in countries that really can't afford it. And the fear is that China is essentially trying to establish facts on the ground around the globe that it can seize, that it can take back to sort of expand its empire, if it will. And another issue that has sort of come to the fore of late, which is getting a little more attention, but perhaps not as much as it should, is what China is doing in the northwestern province of Xinjiang, what it calls the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or XUAR, I guess is the acronym. Bottom line is China has decided that all Uyghurs are terrorists, and as a result, it's going to incarcerate most of the population in what they euphemistically call it, only a communist regime can say this, vocational camps. And there's all kinds of human rights violations that are taking part in that area of the world. I've written about it a little bit in my third book, The Lesser Jihads, but I've decided to bring in somebody who knows a lot more about this situation than I do to sort of weigh in on what China is doing and how it is justifying its policy under the so-called war on terrorism. So I'm delighted to have Professor Sean Roberts with me today. He is an associate professor at George Washington University, of course, in Washington, D.C. And more importantly, he is the author of a book that's hot off the presses from Princeton University called The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority. So, Professor Roberts, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's go back to first principles for a lot of people who don't know a lot about the Uyghurs. By the way, I should mention to my audience that you actually speak and write Uyghur. That's correct, is it?
Yes, that is correct.
That's quite impressive. I was a linguist, both when I worked in signals intelligence and I taught linguistics at undergraduate for 15 years. And I know Uyghur is a Turkic language. It's an Altaic language and not that easy to learn. So as an aside, can I just ask how it is that you were able to pick up Uyghur?
Yeah, well, I mean, I began by learning Uzbek, which is very closely related to Uyghur. And there are some resources in the U.S. when I was in graduate school to study Uzbek. I also studied in Uzbekistan, took Uzbek lessons there. And then when I started doing my dissertation research in Kazakhstan, I took Uyghur lessons there as well and lived with the Uyghur community. And actually, everybody learns languages differently, but I learned it particularly through living with the community and speaking daily with them. I think I picked up much more that way than from the lessons per se.
That's a remarkable achievement. I'm really quite impressed. I did a bit of Turkish myself years ago. And as I said, I see things from a linguist perspective, and I know how challenging, let's just say, Turkic languages are. So kudos to you for picking it up. So the first question, Professor Roberts, is a very basic one. Who are the Uyghurs, and why has this issue come to the fore much more from a global perspective over the last decade or decade and a half or so?
Well, so, as you mentioned, the Uyghurs are a Turkic people, and they really share much culturally and linguistically with the people of the former Soviet Central Asian states, especially with the Uzbeks, whose language is basically mutually intelligible. I guess if you study the region of Central Asia, the Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, it's almost it's almost natural to also include the Uyghur area because historically there were lots of back and forth between these people, and linguistically and culturally they really share a lot more than the Uyghurs do, say, with the Han inside China. Um, there's about 11 million Uyghurs inside China, primarily, as you mentioned, in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or the XUAR. They Uyghurs view this region as their homeland, and twice in the 20th century they established proto-states in parts of the region, both of which were called the Eastern Turkistan Republic. And so some Uyghurs will refer to this region as Eastern Turkestan. Others will generally try not to use the name Xinjiang because that means new territory, which kind of belies the fact that this is not naturally a part of China.
Well, I didn't know that Xinjiang meant new territory in Chinese. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and so that reason, you'll hear some Uyghurs will just call it the Uyghur region. In my book, I try to not use Xinjiang unless it's being used in terms of, the administrative official name of the region. So I call it either the Uyghur region or the Uyghur homeland. And since the Arab conquest of Central Asia, most Uyghurs have been Muslim, and most today identify as such. However, the practice of Islam in the region is quite eclectic. There's a lot of influence of Sufism. I think within the Uyghur community, there's a variety of ways of practicing Islam. And there's many Uyghurs who view Islam more as a cultural identity than a religious faith. It's not uncommon to find Uyghurs who drink alcohol or eat pork. So it's as you might guess, being far from the center of Islam, it has its own kind of history of religion. Mm-hmm.
No, I was going to say that strikes me as very similar to what we see in Indonesia, being very far from the birthplace of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. Indonesian Islam historically has also been rather eclectic, also heavily Sufi influenced. Would it be fair to say, Professor Roberts, then, that fundamentalism is not one thing one would normally associate? And I'm overgeneralizing here, but that fundamentalism is something that one would not normally associate with the practice of Islam in East Turkestan?
Yeah, no, it's certainly not really a major part of the history of the Uyghurs. In fact, I would say that Uyghurs were always very far from the major kind of trends in Islam globally. One of the things I note is that some of the political Islam in the Uyghur region actually owes itself more to a reformist movement in Central Asia during the 19th century than it does to the kind of more recent ideas of fundamentalism. And I think this is a important issue because it's people sometimes are looking for fundamentalism in expressions of Salafism. Among Uyghurs, it's very difficult. You may find people who adopt certain practices related to Salafism, but that they may not themselves identify as Salafist, and they may simultaneously have other practices related to different tendencies in Islam globally. So yeah, it is. I think that this is true about Islam in Asia in general, as you mentioned, Indonesia, Central Asia, and elsewhere as well, Malaysia even.
Okay, so just for my listeners who aren't as familiar with the term Salafism, this is a sort of a back to roots movement that developed really sort of in the middle of the 18th century, where there were a group of people in the Arabian Peninsula that thought Islam had lost its way and it needed to go back to what they call as-salaf as-salih, which are the sort of the faithful ancestors. And this is one thing that has driven, in part, not totally, but in part, the move in Islamist extremism in the 20th and 21st centuries. So if The Islam practice in East Turkestan is not something that one would normally associate with a problem, i.e., leading to possible terrorism. Why does China think it has a problem in that part of the country? What has driven the Chinese government to take these extraordinary measures, up to and including mass incarceration, the complete almost extirpation of the Uyghur culture, and the sort of banishment of Islam as a practice? Why has China gone down that road?
Well, I mean, I think that it's an interesting question because I view, and I outline this in my book, I view what's happening to the Uyghurs inside China right now really being about the Chinese state's integration of the Uyghur homeland. It's a lot of what's happening to Uyghurs is reminiscent of what happened to Native Americans, both in the U.S. and Canada in the 19th century when both the U.S. and Canada kind of expanded their reach westward. So you have basically mass internment, forced assimilation measures, boarding schools. And I think this is really at the heart of what's happening to these people. There's very much an attempt to kind of erase their community, their social capital, and at the same time erase any signs of their cultural links to the land. Because I think for the Chinese state, the main objective is to integrate the Uyghur homeland as kind of a generic part of a monocultural China. But I think the terrorism justification for what's happening makes a lot of sense from the Chinese perspective in the context of the global war on terror. Now, there is an article that came out this year that was kind of a high profile article by a group of political scientists in the Journal of International Security that was trying to say, well, the Chinese state sees this as a terrorism problem. The international community should be engaging them from that standpoint as a terrorism problem. And I kind of disagree with that because I question whether the Chinese state really thinks it has a terrorism problem, or even if it does, whether what they're defining as terrorism is the same thing that we would define as terrorism. So one thing that we see in China is I guess since the late, even since before 9/11, this started to happen early in the 2000s. China started talking about what they term the three evils: terrorism, extremism, and separatism.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of paint these three alleged threats to society as being one and the same. So if you look at, separatism could be viewed as any signs of an interest in self-determination, whether peaceful or through armed struggle. Extremism becomes any sign of religious practice not approved by the state. And terrorism is any sign of violence, whether it's premeditated or not, politically motivated or not, or targeting civilians or not. And so from that standpoint, I think, for the Chinese state, their biggest concern is any Uyghur calls for self-determination. And in this kind of rubric of the three evils, they can paint that as a terrorism threat.
I'm really fascinated by hearing you say that, because a couple of things came to mind while I was listening to you. One is that this is very analogous to what they've been doing in Tibet, since the 1950s, trying to erase any trace of Tibetan culture, of course, and any sort of, religious practices they don't like. I also found it fascinating that China is not the only country that has exploited the so-called global war on terrorism, a term that I have railed against since President Bush, used it in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. Russia's done the same thing. Many countries have said, "Oh, we're just doing this because these guys are all terrorists."
Mm-hmm.
So you do push back on this notion that it really isn't a terrorism problem. And yet it seems to me, based on my knowledge, and it's not as deep as yours, that in fact there have been acts of terrorism that have been carried out in China by Uyghur, what I would call Uyghur Islamist extremists. There are at least two terrorist groups that I think are related. If I read your book correctly, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM, and the Turkistan Islamic Party, or the TIP, both of which I believe have actually sent fighters to go fight with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. I believe there are also Uyghurs fighting in Afghanistan. So what would your response be to the contention or the counterclaim that, pushing aside whether or not China's response has been proportionate, I don't think it is any more than you do, that there really is a very small element within the Uyghur population in East Turkestan, in the XUAR, that truly have carried out acts of terrorism, and that there really are terrorists amongst that population?
Well, so I think first of all, I feel that the problem with the global war on terror and how it's facilitated this kind of use, kind of like political weaponization by various states, is that it doesn't define what is a terrorist or what is terrorism. I in my introduction to my book, I make a case for a specific definition, because I do think terrorism is a problem, but it's become conflated to any sort of political Islam, which is, one, very racially and ethnically profiled or religiously profiled to Islam, and two, doesn't get to the core problem of terrorism. So I define terrorism as premeditated political violence that deliberately targets civilian populations. I think that is a definition that basically holds non-state actors accountable to the same regulations, the same kind of norms that states are held to in conflict. It's a war crime to deliberately target civilians in war, and that, I think, is what's reprehensible about terrorism, is innocent civilians getting caught up in what might be a political conflict that, whether you deem it a legitimate conflict or not, it's a conflict, and it should not involve targeting innocent civilians with violence. So, from that standpoint, I do not see there being a very substantial terrorist threat at all from Uyghurs inside China. The story of ETIM that I tell in the book is of a very small group of Uyghurs in Afghanistan who came to the country during the late 1990s, who wanted to launch an insurgency in China to liberate the Uyghur homeland from Chinese rule. But it was completely inconsequential and never succeeded in mounting any militant action. And while these Uyghurs were inspired by Islam, they were not proponents of global jihad. In fact, my research suggests that they had very strained relations with both the Taliban and Al Qaeda, and to some degree, it seems that the Chinese state was able to come to an agreement with the Taliban at that time to make sure that this group was immobilized, could not really carry out any acts of violence. But one of the important things in this story is that the U.S., well, first, the People's Republic of China, immediately after 9/11, mounted a huge public relations campaign to get the international community to recognize basically any Uyghur political movement as a terrorist group connected to Al Qaeda, and this mostly fell on deaf ears. But in 2002, the United States recognized this group, ETIM, which never called itself that, as a terrorist organization, and it helped China get the UN to list the group on the so-called consolidated list of the UN Security Council. While there's no smoking gun to prove this fact, I think most people at the time and still consider this act by the U.S. Kind of a quid pro quo to make sure that China was acquiescent to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was already being
Mm-hmm.
planned at that time in the summer of 2002. So I don't really see this group as being a terrorist threat. You know, it was kind of I guess, a proto militant group that never got off the floor in carrying out any acts of insurgency. And it basically disappears in 2003 when the Pakistan military kills its alleged leader, Hassan Massoum. Shortly after that, you start to see another group, which you mentioned, the Turkistan Islamic Party, or TIP, emerge. And it really starts becoming well known in 2008 because it produces some videos threatening the Beijing Olympics in 2008. But my research suggests that this group was a handful of Uyghurs who had likely joined foreign forces supporting Al Qaeda and the Pakistan Taliban in Waziristan at this time, and were given, video equipment and was producing a lot of propaganda, but was really had no capacity to do anything inside China.
I think we're probably going to agree on much of this. I certainly have been saying for years that a lot of countries, including United States and China, have certainly, I think, over exaggerated the threat from terrorism, whether it's
Mhm.
internally or in other countries. I think that's certainly true, and yet there's no question, at least in my mind, that there have in fact been what I would call, I think, what anyone would call acts of terrorism in China carried out by Uyghurs. And of course, I think the most famous one, which you do cite in your book, is the Kunming train station attack
Mhm.
in March of 2014, in which over 30 people died and close to 150 were wounded by knife-wielding people who, as I said, I believe were Uyghur Islamist extremists. Having said that, and that's not the only attack, there have been a few in China over in the 2010s. So we have a situation where there definitely is a perhaps, as you put it, a small handful of
Mhm.
individuals who've been radicalized to violence and are carrying out acts in what they see to be the furtherance of either Uyghur nationalism or Islamist supremacy, whatever you want to call it. So having said that, and push back if you think you need to,
Mhm.
why was it that, or is it sort of, I'm asking a silly question in saying that China has used a few incidents here and there to overgeneralize the problem to justify its actions in the XUAR?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is the case, and I think one of the things, it's kind of an academic argument. Does the state really believe it has a terrorist threat or not?
An existential threat, as they often
Yeah,
put it.
yeah, and I think that there's probably plenty of bureaucrats who've kind of bought into that narrative and believe it entirely. But I have difficulty believing that the central state apparatus of China believes that. Just given that you would assume that Chinese intelligence is well aware of the extent of a threat. And it's my interpretation that, as you mentioned, about 10 years after the U.S. recognized the existence of an alleged Uyghur terrorist threat, we have about, I would say, maybe 4 to 5 violent acts allegedly carried out by Uyghurs that look like terrorism by my definition. They target civilians. There was a whole bunch of violence before that, which are really much more like clashes between Uyghurs and security forces.
Hmm.
But you have a couple of these acts that I would categorize as terrorism, but it seems that they don't actually have any direct connection to these groups abroad.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
They're more lone wolf attacks, which I think is something that needs a lot more attention in kind of the counterterrorism industrial complex. I mean, there's people who are frustrated by any number of potentially legitimate grievances who end up taking up arms, and attacking civilians. And that seems to be what we saw in China. Um, and yet, the groups abroad would applaud these acts of violence, but they would never claim responsibility for them. Which I think is interesting, and I think the Chinese state was very aware of that, and so the Chinese state was, if anything, it was concerned that these videos were getting in the hands of Uyghurs and inspiring Uyghurs to violence. But that's also hard to believe given the extensive internet controls that China has had. Um, but I do think that it's a convenient convenient narrative to use as a justification to attack a population that's within your state. As you said, a lot of what the Chinese state wants to do with the Uyghur homeland is very much like what it wants to do with Tibet. But the measures are much more extreme in the Uyghur region because the Uyghurs are Muslims and much more easier to paint as terrorists.
These are really I like the way you put that, Professor Roberts. I think that for a lot of people, Islam is almost synonymous with terrorism. I'm constantly fighting back against this notion in my social media that people say essentially that all Muslims are potential terrorists down the road. So if we've agreed that there have been a couple of attacks here and there in China, which certainly would meet the definition of terrorism, and I share your frustration. A colleague of mine in the Netherlands, Alex Schmidt, a few years ago looked at how many definitions of terrorism there are, and he stopped at 200. So we can see how difficult this is a term to sort of get our heads around. So we have a very small problem. As you stated, it's, to say it's existential is a joke. You rightly cited the size of the Chinese security forces, their control over social media, over the internet. So there's, these guys there's no way in hell these Uyghur extremists are going to have any real impact on the situation in China. And yet the Chinese response has been catastrophic for the Uyghurs. Now, you use the term cultural genocide in your book. I wonder if you would sort of expand on that notion.
Sure. Yeah. What we're seeing, as I mentioned kind of at the outset of our conversation, is very much what we've seen Indigenous peoples, or First Nations, as you call them in Canada, have suffered historically at the hands of settler colonialism. So, the headline grabbing aspect of what's happening are these mass internment camps, where
they're schools, they're educational centers. You've got the term wrong.
Yeah. But they've extra legally put up to 10% of the population in these camps, and then they have a massive surveillance network that is really cutting edge. I mean, it's very frightening. In fact, even before information emerged about the camps, there were lots of journalistic pieces about the mass surveillance in this region that is using all kinds of artificial intelligence and so on, is very Orwellian, and is immediately strikes fear in anybody who is worried about the power of technology today. And so the combination of that surveillance and the punishment of random punishment of being sent to a camp means that you get essentially a manufacturing of consent. Any Uyghur who does not acquiesce to state policies has the likelihood that they're going to be either put in a camp or directly in a prison. And that's allowing the state to do all kinds of things that have been less highlighted in the media, in terms of destroying Uyghur villages, putting Uyghurs in residential labor communities, residential factories, putting children in residential schools, starting as early as kindergarten, where they're only taught the Chinese language, and basically erasing any sign of the Uyghur legacy in their homeland, with the exception of things that might be useful for tourism. So you really see kind of the wiping out of this population, and the fear that's created is also breaking down any sense of community, because people are worried about being turned in by their neighbors or being overheard discussing something that might end up sending them to a mass internment camp. So it's really very much targeting, I think, Uyghur identity and Uyghur culture writ large. And this is something, as I mentioned, we've seen a lot historically in terms of First Nations that have been essentially wiped out. They continue to exist, but their power to exist has been severely curtailed. So I use the term cultural genocide rather than just genocide to kind of highlight that this is much more a story about the destruction of an indigenous population than it is a story akin to the Holocaust. And we haven't seen yet the mass extermination of Uyghurs, but certainly the policies that are being undertaken by the Chinese state are certainly reducing the population. There's also been information emerging about mass sterilizations. There's an attempt to promote interethnic marriage, which, if you refuse to take part in, might send you to a mass internment camp. So there's really an attempt to erase these people as we know them.
There have even been examples that the Chinese activities are not limited to China itself. I've heard reports of arrests being made and deportations from Central Asia, where they're perhaps putting pressure on governments to deport Uyghurs they see as activists or people trying to push back. We have credible reporting here in Canada of Canadian Uyghurs who get threatening text messages or phone calls, essentially saying, "Hi, how's your family doing back home? Click." So in other words, it's a warning, just shut up with what you're saying. There was also a famous incident at a university a few years ago where a Uyghur activist was trying to talk about the situation in the XUAR and was shouted down by people who were either in the pay of China or were put up to essentially prevent her from speaking. So I think that this documented, as you say, cultural genocide it's well known. Been a lot of good reporting in Western media over the last few years. You've obviously studied this in quite some detail. Let me ask you a difficult question, Professor Roberts. Why does the world not seem to care?
That's a very good question. I think the world does care, but with anything, when we're looking at global events, I think that unfortunately, humanitarian crises that are far from home are low down on the list of priorities. I mean, we certainly are seeing pushback from the United States, from European countries, from Canada. But another problem is that the power of China economically right now means that pushback is also, to a certain degree, limited.
Exactly.
I basically feel that states right now are unlikely able to influence this situation and change the behavior of the Chinese state. I think that there's a need for a more grassroots movement to really focus. I think back to the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, where you could really see the impact of global consumer advocacy in terms of trying to get institutions to divest of companies that are entangled in this and get people to boycott products that are coming out of this. Because one of the things we're finding is, as the mass internment program has moved to a coercive labor program in residential factories, global supply chains are being infected with this coerced Uyghur labor. And as a result, I think that a lot of global brands such as Nike and Gap um, are basically complicit in what's happening to the Uyghurs. And that's a real opportunity, I think, for consumer advocacy, which is something that's becoming more popular, I think, in the world today, and more powerful given the power of social media. You can really mount a campaign where you'll see companies quickly try to disentangle themselves from something that is rightfully scandalous.
But is it not true, Professor Roberts, that the pushing back against South Africa in the 80s against apartheid was more doable given the relatively small size of the South African economy? As you mentioned, I mean, the Chinese economy is, I think, if I read my statistics correctly, if not the largest, I think it's surpassed the United States, or it's very close to doing so. I'm old enough to remember when made in China was a joke. Yeah. When anything made in China, you would dismiss. Of course, you don't do that nowadays. So is there any realistic a possibility that a grassroots consumer-led boycott of Chinese goods is going to have any effect?
Well, I mean, I think that it requires actions across the board. Some of that grassroots advocacy is also about making sure that states are responding to this. One of the things that we've seen is, so far, the states that have responded to this issue with China are Western democracies, and the developing world has been noticeably silent. And in particular, the Muslim world, which would have plenty of reason to look at this as essentially anti-Muslim, and basically a Muslim cultural genocide in China. Mm-hmm. But they have been very reticent because of the power of China economically. And I think that, however, even in more authoritarian states like Saudi Arabia and so on, if the population itself starts to get up in arms about it, the state is going to feel that it has to respond. Mm-hmm. So we're even starting finally to see, I think, some movement in the Muslim world. But certainly, I guess it's an unfortunate commentary on humanity that most genocides we've witnessed, certainly in my lifetime, the response of the international community has always been too late. And
that does seem to be an unfortunate aspect of humanity. I'm so glad you raised the issue of Muslim states, which I find utterly shameful, that they know exactly what's going on and have been kowtowed by the Chinese to say nothing. If because of economics, because of their participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. I know Pakistan, for example, relies a lot on Chinese economic aid and for infrastructure, and so can't say anything to do that. If I could ask you sort of one last unfair question, Professor Roberts, where do you think all this is going with China's actions in the XUAR?
In my book, I outline kind of a grim conclusion. I mean, I could very easily see that the Uyghur population within China being completely marginalized within its homeland, that the region actually looks just like a generic part of China anywhere else in the country. And those Uyghurs who remain in the region, I mean, I could even see a situation that, they essentially become isolated on something akin to reservations. I see the conclusion to really be the same conclusion we've seen from cultural genocides elsewhere in the world. Now, that said, one of the things I can say from having studied the Uyghur people for, at least 3 decades, is that they're very resilient, and I can't see them letting that happen without any bit of pushback. And right now, it's almost impossible for Uyghurs inside China to push back because they can be immediately neutralized, put in camps or prisons, and basically taken out of society. But there is a significant population of Uyghurs abroad, and that population has grown since 2009, when there was really when the massive crackdown on Uyghurs inside China accelerated. And so a lot of people, there about maybe as many as 30,000 from that period came to Turkey. Also, a significant number have come to the U.S., Canada, Europe, and elsewhere, even in Southeast Asia. So I do see that the Uyghur population abroad is going to be pushing back on this endlessly, and that will at the very least ensure that there's some kind of reckoning for this over the long term, is my hope.
I sincerely hope you're right. I don't disagree with you. This is I like your term cultural genocide, and I've had the opportunity to actually meet with some Canadian Uyghurs. I'm a fellow at the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies at Concordia University, and I've had a chance to talk with them. And I certainly agree with you that there has to be some serious pushback and some serious consequences for Chinese action in what it's doing, not just against the Uyghurs, but in Tibet and in Hong Kong as well. As I've been saying for a long time now, maybe this is my intelligence background showing through. China's not our friend, and I wish we would stop pretending that it is so. Professor Roberts, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation with you on your book. Congratulations on its publication. If I may ask one last question, where does your research take you next?
Well, actually, I'm working on a book that looks at just what we were talking about in terms of how the global war on terror has been used by different states, and looking at that in comparative format, looking at the case of the Uyghurs and the case of the Uzbeks and the case of the Chechens. And I'm hoping to be able to kind of get to look more specifically how these populations have ended up getting entangled with the global war on terror. And I do see this as generally being something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. States isolate populations and basically accuse them of being terrorists. And as a result, you see a lot of them finding refuge among extremist groups abroad. And I think this is it's an important thing to take note of, because, although we sometimes forget it, the global war on terror is still ongoing, and it's still creating these same problems. If you look at the groups, the foreign fighters in Syria, they're not the same foreign fighters who were around in 2001. They're from other countries. They're from countries where people have been suppressed and repressed in the name of counterterrorism. And it's something of a self-fulfilling prophecy that they basically can only find refuge among extremists who basically make that terrorist threat a reality. So I want, I kind of want that book to be a rallying call to hopefully end the war on terror as we know it. That doesn't mean that we should stop non-state actors from targeting civilians, but it means that we really need to reevaluate what it means to combat terrorism.
Well, you'll get no pushback from me as somebody who worked in counterterrorism for 15 years with the security service in Canada and who has written 5 books on Islamist extremism and religious terrorism. I couldn't agree with you more that, and I've said this since the beginning, that the war on terrorism is one of the most ill-chosen terms in the history of ideas and has caused all kinds of problems. And you're right, we have to do counterterrorism, but we don't have to frame it as a war on terrorism, because as someone very wisely stated just after 9/11, declaring war on common nouns is generally a very, very bad idea because they never end. And you've pointed out rightly that there's been many abuses by states such as China, such as Russia as well, in framing problems through that lens. So, Professor Roberts, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. I congratulations on your book, which I'm looking forward to reading in much greater detail. And thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
That was my conversation with Professor Sean Roberts from George Washington University and looking at the Uyghur problem in northwestern China and China's response to it. Let me know what you think. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. You'll also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content and want to get more, simply go to my website, borealisthreatrisk.com, hit the subscribe button, provide me with your information. You'll get a free digest, all podcasts, all blogs, free to your inbox every morning. Hope to hear from you. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.